Marhaba Astakai. Hello, my friends. My name is Daniel Baker, and in a recent devotional, I shared about how my wife Natalie and I have been living in the Middle East for the last 2 years, and how we've been learning to reread the scriptures through Middle Eastern eyes. And today, I wanted to explore the topic of shame together. Now, in biblical times and in modern times in the Middle East, honor and shame is the basis of life. A good definition of shame is a deep internal pain or distress caused by our consciousness of improper behavior. That behavior being our words, our actions, or maybe even our inactions. And because of sin, we are all cursed with a deep shame. But the good news is that God has carried our shame for us. And to explore this idea a little bit more, I wanted to look at Luke chapter 15 together. Verses 1 and 2 say, tax collectors and other notorious sinners often came to Jesus to listen to him teach. This made the Pharisees and teachers of religious law complain that he was associating with such sinful people, even eating with them. So we see Jesus here associating with the most sinful examples of society, tax collectors who had betrayed their countrymen. It says other notorious sinners. We're thinking of probably prostitutes, drunkards, people on the outskirts of society who have been shamed and shunned and put out of their families. And Jesus chooses to confront the religious leaders with 3 stories to really challenge their thinking about these people and to challenge their thinking about those who are shamed. And he uses these stories, the story of the lost sheep, the lost coin, and the lost son. This whole chapter is beautiful, but we don't have time to look at it all. So we're going to look at the last story, which is the story of the lost son, because I believe this story is a really powerful example that Jesus gives, explaining how he sees himself as choosing to carry our shame for us and on our behalf. So in verses 11 through 19, it says, Jesus told them this story. A man had 2 sons. The younger son told his father, I want my share of your estate now before you die. So his father agreed to divide his wealth between his sons. A few days later, this younger son packed all his belongings and moved to a distant land, and there he wasted all his money in wild living. About the time his money ran out, a great famine swept over the land, and he began to starve. He persuaded a local farmer to hire him, and the man sent him into his fields to feed the pigs. The younger man became so hungry that even the pods he was feeding the pigs looked good to him, but no one gave him anything. When he finally came to his senses, he said to himself, At home, even the hired servants have food enough to spare, and here I am dying of hunger. I will go home to my father and say, Father, I have sinned against both heaven and you, and I am no longer worthy of being called your son. Please take me on as one of your hired servants. So here we see Jesus painting a picture to his listeners of the epitome of a shameful person. This son has asked for his inheritance. It's a slap in the face of his father. He's basically saying, I wish you were dead. And he's shirking his responsibilities in the family. He's drinking, he's sleeping around, he's wasting foolishly all of his inheritance on wild living. And then after all the money has run out, he has to tie himself to this foreigner and do very shameful, dirty work. He has to work with pigs. And pigs in the East, in Middle Eastern culture, are incredibly impure creatures that they taint us to be with them or to eat them or whatever it may be. So to work with them and to want to share their food is an extremely shameful thing. Finally, he has to go home and he has to beg for his life. So just imagine what the religious leaders and the other listeners would have been thinking at this point in the story. You can just imagine their faces. They were probably revolted at this young man that Jesus is describing. Then we read in verse 20, So the young man returned home to his father, and while he was still a long way off, his father saw him coming. So everyone listening to Jesus' story would have known the appropriate response. Kill him. Kill the son. Whether it be the father, whether it be another family member, whether it be a faithful servant or friend, someone needs to kill this guy. And this may sound crazy, But shame is not primarily about right and wrong. It's about right and wrong being seen or not seen, heard or not heard. So the only way for them to clear their name as a family, or for them to do away with this shame and avoid it coming back upon them, would be to do away with the son. The listeners would have certainly been thinking, if the father doesn't kill him, somebody else will. What is this kid doing anyways? He's coming back in the middle of day. The father could see him. He's coming back in broad daylight, out in the open air on the street, in public. He's returning home. Even in his returning to the father, he's bringing shame on the father and on the family. But Jesus' story does not go the way that his listeners would have thought. We read in verses 20 through 24, "Filled with love and compassion, the father ran to his son, embraced him and kissed him. His son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against both heaven and you, and I am no longer worthy of being called your son.' But his father said to the servants, 'Quick, bring the finest robe in the house and put it on him. Get a ring for his finger and sandals for his feet, and kill the calf we've been fattening. We must celebrate with a feast, for this son of mine was dead and has now returned to life. He was lost, but now he is found.'" Actually, the father's actions here are shameful. The father runs to his son. The father should have ignored the son. The father should have shut the door and gone away. He should have ignored him. He should have let somebody else clean up this mess. But instead, the father has compassion. He lifts his robes and he runs out to him. In Middle Eastern culture, it's an extremely shameful thing for old men or men of honor and status to be running. This father was certainly a man of wealth, of means. He had servants. He has fattened calves. He would be a well-known figure in society. And he's choosing, in front of everyone out there in public that can see what's going on, to lift his robe and be the first to make it to the son so that no one could harm his son. He embraces this disgraced, tainted child. The father doesn't care. He loves and he has compassion, and he begins to take the shame of his son onto himself. The father chooses to step into his child's shame, and he elevates and restores his son's honor and sonship. He clothes him with the best robe in the house. He puts on the family ring on his finger, and he celebrates the son openly and publicly with a large, lavish party. Now, this story is Jesus explaining to everyone around him how he sees himself and why he is meeting and associating and eating the lowest of the low in society. He is taking on the shame of the people and elevating them to a place of honor and sonship. Now, we don't have time to get into the rest of this story about the older son and how Jesus is actually critiquing the religious leaders and the Pharisees through the example of the oldest son's response. That's a whole another video. But let's just ponder this amazing truth together, that Jesus has stepped into our shame for us. He's carried it for us on the cross. Each of us has had shame in our life, but we can offload that onto Jesus, who has carried it for us. Jesus has elevated each of us to a status of honored and righteous children. It says in Hebrews 12:2, "Let's look to Jesus, who for the joy that was set before him, the lost coin, the lost sheep, the lost son, you and me, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross and disregarded its shame." He despised the shame. He ignored it. Now Jesus is seated at the right hand of the throne of God, honored, elevated, and he's extending his hand, an invitation to you and I. Come and sit.